grad school. Okay, got it. Recording, we're recording, we're live. It's Memorex. Scott and Lori are here. And Marty, who's Marty? Say hi, Marty. You can unmute too. You know, we're casual here. We're gonna just banter and oh, hey there. Oh, wow, look at that puppy dog.
I think you just have to click on the poll again and it should open up when you're ready.
Oh, I have to have it open. Let me see.
Yeah.
There I have it open here. My
It says launched. Just maybe just click on it and see if it opens up again.
I have it open on my screen here.
Oh, maybe I just closed it. Okay. Does anyone else see it?
There's
The poll.
The polls and quizzes. 10 questions.
Wait, I see the quiz.
Oh, good. Okay, then.
I mean, you could actually answer the questions and I think it'll tabulate. If it doesn't, we're just trying it out. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to go through this thing and have some fun and hopefully get some information out of it. How's everybody doing out there? Getting ready for the holidays? And celebration is coming up. So that'll be fun. The celebration has been sold out for the last bunch of years. So we're only a couple weeks away. So don't forget about that. And yeah, feel free at any point in the next couple weeks. We're getting ready for our new hatchery season. So we never shut down in the winter. Winter is actually our busiest time of the year because that's when we create all the new critters. So if anyone wants to get involved with that, or we're going to have we'll get some emails out for the Valentine's Day spawn because we want to have a kind of a more festive party during that and you know, get some food going, and the music's always going, the candles are always going. And Kimmy, my wife, who is retiring, is excited to be part of things with Cornell for a change instead of always being at school. So we'll see what happens there. Is that poll working? Maybe it's not working. I don't see anybody. Let me try it. All the algae grown must be local species, so not to injure. See, I can't even get it to work. Maybe it doesn't work.
I don't know. I can't see that it's that I can click on anything.
I just clicked on.
I just got it to work.
You did.
And I'm not sure why, but I did get to make a pick.
All right, let's see.
Oh, because how do I do that? Save.
Yeah, now I can do it.
Yeah.
Mine doesn't work. Well,
Mine is now working.
oh, good.
I wonder what you did to make it work.
I just answered all true.
Oh, well.
I did what I always did in college. I just
Yeah, you have 50-50 chance of getting it right.
I'm clicking on.
No, I don't know. It did just start to I don't know. Am I the only one who has it working?
Kim,
Yeah.
we might not be able to because we're hosts. Maybe we can't answer the questions. We can only see how everyone else did.
Did
I don't
anyone
know.
else? Yeah, but it wouldn't it even register percent? I don't know. I guess it's not working. I don't know. Well, I can leave it on and people can fool around with it, but I'm gonna go through this final exam, and we are being recorded. So at least for folks that wanted to see how they did on the final exam. And it's mostly a review, you know, I have to figure out what I'm going to do in 2024 with the lectures. I want to keep the lecture series going. I'm not sure if we should do a poll on that. If people want to do live back at the Marine Center or continue to do Zoom lectures, which is kind of convenient because you can sit around your house and eat and do various things while we're doing this. My only issue is that we've recorded all of them, so it starts to be redundant. I'd like to mix it up either with guests or whatnot, but that didn't, so far hasn't panned out in the past. But maybe we can we'll send out an email poll to see what people are thinking about how they want to access or participate in the lecture series. Because what happens is every year for the last 20 some odd years, we've been doing these lecture series, and they always follow an order. And the order is based on our needs for the program. So January, we have a extreme need for algae. So we have the algae lecture. February, we have an extreme need for conditioning broodstock and spawning. So we do that lecture. Right after that, we do our larval rearing. So we do that lecture. Then they go through their larval cycle and they're going to metamorphose and become spat. And then we have a lecture on the post set. Then they go through all the equipment that grow them into bigger handleable seed. And that's a lecture on all the equipment, the upwellers, downwellers, and various equipment we use. Then we talk finally about the garden and how to configure the garden. And then we have kind of a mixed bag at the end, which brings us up to November final exam, which is just a review of everything we did in the lectures for the year. So, for instance, question number 1 in the final is, all of the algae grown at Cornell must be local species so as not to introduce non-native varieties to the water. Well, that sure sounds like a good answer as being true, and it's totally false. As a matter of fact, maybe of the 8 or 9 flavors that we grow in the big hatchery, possibly one of them is indigenous or local species, and that would be a diatom that we grow called Chaetoceros calcitrans. That's in our waters. That's a diatom, and it's a cold water tolerant species that comes up, probably the first algae that comes up in the early spring. All of the other algae we grow are pretty much aquacultural grade high test algae, and they are absolutely not native to New York. For instance, one of the species that is kind of the industry standard for pretty much all shellfish hatcheries is a strain called T-iso. And what T-iso stands for is Tahitian Isochrysis galbana. And that clearly is not New York. That's Tahiti. And as a matter of fact, that was the first algae I ever grew in grad school. And I had this little crazy place on the campus of GSO, the Graduate School of Oceanography. And in the summer, the room I was growing it in would get to be 100 degrees. And this algae flourished in 100 degrees. So, and it will not flourish in cold weather. So it is clearly not a native species. Now, the question then becomes, well, if you have these non-native algae species and you put them in the creek over, let's say, at South Hole. Oh, Kimmy's running around in the camera. If you dumped, for instance, T-iso into the creek, would it bloom up and compete with native algae? And so far, in pretty much everybody's experience with growing non-native species of algae in a hatchery situation, have there ever been any blooms of those algae species in the waters. So I think it's pretty much a non-issue. And I say that thinking back in the days when brown tide came in out of nowhere and really took over and wreaked holy havoc in Peconic Bay. So you would think, well, you know, you're kind of playing with fire, but the truth is, if, for instance, our green algae, our Tetraselmis species of algae were to bloom up in the creeks, I think things would do very well by that because it's such a tremendous algae. It's not a harmful algae. Brown tide was a harmful algae, and it was harmful. All the ones we grow in the hatchery are not only are they not harmful, but they're incredibly nutritive for shellfish species, at least, if not other things. So it's never come up as an issue about growing non-indigenous species and allowing them to go into our waters. And that probably will continue that way. I don't think there will be regulations that change that anytime soon. You could change it because you could always keep algae from going in the creek by chlorinating it and killing it instead of throwing it down the sink. But again, you know, good algae are good algae, and there are a lot of species of algae in the marine system, and our indigenous ones, and there's many species of indigenous algae in our water. And the more they bloom up, the better things normally do. It's our harmful algae that we really have to pay attention to, including red tide species that have come up. And when a red tide species comes up, you hear about it. There'll be a shellfish closure to a red tide, as they call it. That's something that, by the way, can really throw people into a tailspin, because when it reaches the press, it always talks about things like a biotoxin in the water. And it is a biotoxin in the water. It's some of these red tide species are absolutely toxic to humans. Alexandrium is a species that comes up that can cause illness in humans if they eat shellfish that have been eating it in its bloom state. And but when you see it in the press as a biotoxin, you think that like some truck full of toxic waste fell off the bridge or something. And it's a naturally occurring event that happens. Cape Cod, you get a red tide every year. It goes away. The shellfish clears itself out, and you can eat it. But when a red tide, or in particular when a red tide species is blooming in areas where shellfish can eat it, what they do is, Alexandrium, for instance, is not harmful to shellfish. So they can eat it, they can eat it, they can eat it. And what happens is they bioaccumulate. So in other words, they concentrate those algae cells in their gut. And so if you eat shellfish that's been eating a harmful red algae like Alexandrium, it's like taking a dose of it. It's been concentrated, and you can get sick by it. By the way, do not confuse that with the harmful bacteria that were in the press this year. Vibrios, Vibrio vulnificus, Vibrio parahemolyticus, very, very bad bacteria to be in shellfish and humans eating it. That's not an algae, that's a bacteria. So they're two different issues. And there's a lot of there's a lot of confusion. There was a lot of confusion, in my opinion, about the press that came out about the Vibrios, or as when you want to really sensationalize it, the flesh-eating bacteria that can arise. They arise quite often down south, Louisiana and whatnot. But the press that came out during this event in New York, it was incredibly vague about where these people contracted these Vibrios, because it wasn't, in my opinion, definitive that they derived it A, from shellfish, and B, even from New York. So, you know, you have to be on top of these things. And on another, in another respect, I had a friend of mine. He's the drummer in the jazz quartet I play with, and his son, they live in Sag Harbor area. His son got hit by what I would say was a harmful Vibrio. And he went to the hospital. He had welts all over his body. It was from swimming. It wasn't from eating shellfish. It was from swimming. He got these remarkable lesions that they said was bacteria, but it was never documented, and it was never an issue, even though it's very possible that he did contract an issue with a Vibrio. So sometimes you see the press and blow it out. Sometimes you have an event that happens and nobody ever hears about it. So it's you have to be on top of it. Good. Well, that was question one. Anyone get that one right? Anyone get that one wrong? Doesn't matter. We're not keeping score, but you better get it right next time. Okay. No, that was a good question. I like that question. That was a trick question because almost everything else, for instance, our oyster is a native oyster. It's the only oyster we can grow. We can't grow a non-native oyster in New York. How come we can grow a non-native algae and not grow a non-native oyster? Well, that's what's interesting about that question. Brings up more questions. Here's question two. The blue point oyster, Crassostrea virginica, which, by the way, is the Linnaean Latin name for our oyster, Crassostrea virginica. If you're going to be a Spat member and you're going to go to raw bars and you're going to hoot and holler about how you're an oyster grower, you better well as at least learn the Latin name for our oyster, Crassostrea virginica. Because what does it say? A blue point oyster, Crassostrea virginica, is a different species of oyster. I've got to wear glasses. From Louisiana oyster, Crassostrea gigas. Okay. True or false? Anybody get that? Okay. You don't have to. You can unmute. You can do whatever you want. I'm just babbling. It's a fun little question. Blue point oysters, you know, how many times has anyone said to you, oh, you're growing oysters. What are you growing? Blue points? Well, I guess because on the East Coast, and again, here's this, you got to know this. This is all raw bar one-liner material. You have to know these things. If you're going to show off that you're an oyster grower, there's certain things you must get down. And one of them is from Newfoundland, well, maybe not Newfoundland, but certainly from the Bredor Lakes in Nova Scotia and what are they? And, you know, Prince Edward Island and all the Maritimes, all the way down to Louisiana and the Texas Panhandle, the East Coast of the United States. There's only one oyster that is grown for consumption, and that's Crassostrea virginica, the eastern oyster. Okay. And I say for consumption because, you know, it dawned on me as I'm saying it's the only oyster on the East Coast. Well, if you go to the Florida Keys, you get an oyster down there. It's the mangrove oyster, Crassostrea rhizophora, I believe. So there is another oyster on the East Coast. It's just that nobody eats that oyster. It's kind of like the ribbed mussel. That nobody really eats that, so they don't think about it. And so Blue Point oysters and Louisiana oysters, whatever their name is, are the same oyster, Crassostra virginica. Is the same oyster as a Malpec, is the same oyster as a Chincoteague, is the same oyster as a Wellfleet, is the same oyster as every boutique name of oyster on the East Coast. They're all the same genus species of oyster. Now, that might sound fine to you, but go to the West Coast where anarchy is the key factor. They grow all kinds of different oysters that aren't their oysters. Their oysters on the West Coast is really the Olympia oyster. That's the native oyster of the West Coast. Is that the oyster that they grow in abundance and sell? No. They grow Crassostra gigas, which is the Pacific oyster. Well, how come they can do that? Well, because it's actually a pretty interesting question, and it's interesting history, because I didn't know this until relatively recently. I was watching a chef show with John Finger from Hog Island Oyster Company in Tamales Bay and in parts of California, and he's from Mattatuck actually originally. He's got a great oyster company called Hog Island. And there's a video, I think it's Chef Show episode 4. And he's driving up with the chefs in his boat. And he looks off at one of his culture systems. And he said, "These are our Eastern oysters." And I thought, son of a gun, the guy's growing our oyster too. And so he's growing the Eastern oyster, he's growing the Pacific oyster, he's growing the Kumamoto oyster. He's not growing the European flat oyster, I don't think. But they're growing, a bunch of different species of oyster, and the Olympia oyster, if they can get it. But the point is, and so I thought, wow, they're even growing the Eastern oyster. And then I was doing some peeking around on the internet, and it turns out that the West Coast has been growing the Eastern oyster for a lot longer than it's been growing the Pacific oyster, which was really news to me. I mean, they've been growing the Eastern oyster for like 80, 100 years there. And so I suppose they say it's grandfathered in that they can grow these non-native species. But here's, in my opinion, well, see, now this is an interesting thing, because the Olympia oyster, which is pretty much, it's not extinct, it's pretty rare. It's a tiny little oyster, so I don't think it would be, it's not really the greatest oyster for a big market. Then again, Kumamotos aren't very big either, but the difference, I think, fundamentally is the Crassostra virginica, the Eastern oyster, is only indigenous to the East Coast of the United States. That is our oyster. And so that's not something that you want to displace by having over competition with a foreign species. You could lose your oyster that is your native oyster, that is really, in my opinion, the best oyster you can have. And so, it's very, very protected on the East Coast. You're not allowed to grow any other oyster on the East Coast. You can't just bring Crassostra gigas. By the way, Crassostra gigas, the Pacific oyster, that's the number one. First of all, it's back in the day when I was an adjunct professor teaching world aquaculture, Crassostra gigas was like the number 2 aquaculture product in the world. Because, and maybe it was by metric ton, they weigh a lot. You know what number one is? The Asian carp. God, go try to eat an Asian carp, but that's the number one aquaculture product in the world. It's grown in China, and it probably still out cultures everything else that's grown. But Crassostrea gigas, the Pacific oyster, is the oyster that they grow in Europe, because their indigenous oyster, the European flat oyster, got kind of wiped out for various reasons. So they brought in a new oyster. It wasn't the first oyster that they brought in, by the way. It was I think they brought in the Portuguese oyster first, and that didn't really work out. So they brought in the Pacific oyster, and that's what they grow, the Pacific oyster. But it turns out that almost everywhere in the world that's growing oysters for the market is growing Crassostrea gigas, including, I am told, Australia now, which is kind of interesting because they have their own kind of oysters. So the bottom line is that if anyone ever asks you about your oyster, it's the same oyster up and down the East Coast. They're just branded different, and the terroir of where they're grown takes on the intrigue about how they're so different. I went to the Billion Oyster Project party a bunch of years ago, where they have like 60 different oyster growers, and they made, in my opinion, a very unfair mistake in putting Wellfleet oysters in the kiosk next to Chincoteague oysters. So oysters in the Chesapeake are notoriously not salty because the water is very shallow. It's kind of brackish. It can get down to not close to fresh, but nowhere near as salty as our oyster. So when you eat a Wellfleet, which is wicked salty, it's like, I think the Wellfleet Harbor is something like 29 parts, maybe even higher salinity. So it's very salty. So eating a Wellfleet oyster and then eating a Chincoteague oyster is like eating a Lay's potato chip and then eating a chunk of tofu. And, you know, that's just kind of harsh comparison when you're at an oyster tasting. But interesting, because I mean, it really slaps you in the face, the difference of terroir of oysters, and picking out the nuances of even our oysters, some that are more metallic, some that might be just downright sweeter. I have some really awesome sweet oysters that we've been eating. So that's the fun of what's going to happen on the East Coast, is all this boutiquing that's going on. I think that we should have much more oyster tastings to pull out, like wine tastings, where you're really trying to pull out the different qualities based on where these things are grown, even though they're the same genus and species. And it's happening, but it could happen more, I think. So that was that one. The black line seen on many of the oysters cultured in New York may be an indication of disease-resistant stock from early hatchery breeding practices. Well, yep, there's a whole story behind that, and it's really quite fascinating, because I was in grad school in 1992 when basically a new oyster disease cropped up. And what happened was, and it was really brought to light by Frank M. Flower and Son Oyster Company in Oyster Bay, where for years and years and years and years, Dave Relier and Joe Zatilla were running the hatchery there, and they were growing 60 million oysters for themselves and 60 million clams. And they were selling seed to everybody, and they were the main supplier for just about anybody growing oysters. And in 1992, they lost something like 90% of their oyster seed before it reached the size of a dime. And nobody knew why. And it turns out that it was a new disease. Now, where does a new disease come from? They tracked it they called it at the time juvenile oyster disease because it killed juvenile oysters. And it pretty much killed almost all of them. And what Joe and Dave did, which was, I suppose, common sense, but also clever and important, was to breed the survivors and see if that would help with the disease problem. And it absolutely did. So the next year, instead of losing 90%, they lost maybe 60%, and then they took the survivors of that cohort, and maybe they got 30% until they got no mortality. They bred the disease out of the oyster in a number of cohorts. Now, a couple things about that. One is that while they were doing that, apparently there was a color morph in their broodstock, the black line that runs up the center of the oyster. It had nothing to do per se to the disease resistance for what I'm going to still call for now, and change in a minute, juvenile oyster disease. But it was a color morph, and the genetics of shellfishes are relatively simple. So it transferred to the seed. Now, for years and years and years, they tried to figure out what the disease was. And there were two schools of thought. There was the school of thought that it was a protozoan, like MSX, multinucleated spheroid unknown, or dermo, which is, both of those are caused by a protozoan parasite. It turns out that juvenile oyster disease was a bacteria, a roseavirus bacteria. Now it's called roseavirus disease. So kind of makes sense that you could, in dermo and MSX, they've tried awfully hard to build disease resistance. And some folks that have been working for 20 and 30 years on it would say that they've got disease resistant stocks. But it's different than disease resistant stock to roseavirus, probably because it's a bacteria and the oysters developed an antibody to fight it, which, you know, you can't, if you have a virus, you don't take antibiotics. It's not a bacteria, it's a virus. So antibiotic isn't going to do anything for a virus. Antibiotic wouldn't do anything for a protozoan parasite either. So it kind of made sense that it was a bacteria because you could breed it, literally breed it out of the oyster. So the black line is a nice little reminder that the stocks came from this selective breeding to get rid of that juvenile oyster disease. Oysters can freeze solid and still live. Well, go ahead and try it. Throw them in your freezer and take them out in the spring and put them back in the water. You'll probably find that they're all dead. So it's a little bit of a trick question. Oysters have a built-in antifreeze glycoprotein in their blood that tries to prevent them from freezing solid. But I will tell you, if you leave an oyster out of the water in freezing temperature, they will probably freeze solid and die. Now, the reason why we don't get overly concerned about winterizing oysters is because they're not out of the water, they're in the water. And the water almost acts as an insulation. The reason why I tell people to put the floats on the top of their cages or to sink their cages lower in the water is so that they don't get locked into surface ice where they will probably freeze solid and die. But being below the ice level, they can handle that. I've opened up an oyster that was pretty close to frozen, not so frozen solid, but it was an oystersicle. I opened it up and it's got ice in it. You're eating it, it's like crunchy. Oh, my computer is unplugged. I just got a low battery. There we go. Crunching away like it's a good humor oyster. But if you were to take that oyster with its ice crystals inside of it and put it in some tepid water in the shell and let it defrost, that oyster is still alive. It didn't die. It's just what happens with the antifreeze glycoprotein is it keeps the oyster from freezing around the heart and kidney and key functions. But for the most part, it's almost like putting a woolly mammoth in and defrosting it before it went completely frozen. You might get it to live again. I don't think we'll find a woolly mammoth that is in that state, so we probably won't be able to put a woolly mammoth in a bowl of tepid water and have it walk around the backyard. But you can defrost your oyster if it's not frozen solid. So. Oysters like cold, by the way. Oysters do not like a warm winter. That's where some of these disease pressures can come up. If you've noticed that you had these perfect oysters that were like 2 years old and you were ready to eat them, and all of a sudden you're losing you have a bag of 100 and 10 of them are dead just before you just did them a couple of weeks ago, and now 10 of them are dead. How'd that happen? That could be derma. We haven't had any particularly cold winters. A cold winter, the coldest winter I can recall was the winter that I got to go ice boating out here. That was awesome. I mean, the winter wasn't awesome. I hate cold. I got the wood stove going in like October here, but icing is awesome. And there's not that many times you can go ice boating around here anymore. That's a cold winter. I know a cold winter. I could send you pictures. I think maybe we have in the past of the Cornell Marine Center creek with 8 inches of ice throughout it. It's frozen solid. And that's not, it's not atypical, but it hasn't happened in a while. I mean, we didn't even get skim ice for the last 2 years in the creek. So that's, to me, is a sign of a pretty warm winters. And that's where you might start seeing your larger oysters that have overwintered at least 1 winter and going into 2 or overwintered 2. You can start losing like 10%. They won't all die. That's not how derma works. It kind of works incrementally. So I'm not wishing us a cold winter, but you get a couple, like a month of a good cold snap in the water will keep that disease pressure down. Okay. Metamorphosis in shellfish is irreversible and causes significant internal morphological changes, including rapid growth of shell and gill structure. Boy, that sounds like something that would have been on my graduate thesis defense, and it was. And I didn't actually get it. One of my people on my defense committee asked me, how can you tell microscopically that shellfish has metamorphosed? And I don't know what I said, but I didn't say that. When you look under a microscope at late stage larvae that have gone into metamorphosis, there's no question about what it looks like, and it's awesome. And I highly recommend some folks stop by around, you know, the end of February into early March and whatnot, because you can pop in and you can look under the microscope and see 1 day old metamorphosed oysters. And what happens is, it's really fascinating. I mean, I spent years on my graduate thesis, which was using mammalian neurotransmitters, L-DOPA, epinephrine, serotonin, to induce metamorphosis in oyster larvae so that you could create a cultureless oyster. Well, it turns out, like a lot of things I did in my youth, the chemical way is not the way to go. You got to be all natural in life. It just, you lead a better life, and so do oysters. Okay, oysters don't need L-DOPA and epinephrine, but what's interesting is that they absolutely in nature use those neurotransmitters. Okay, so the way it works is, when oysters metamorphose, when they go from a larval stage to a metamorphic poset stage, what happens is epinephrine dumps into their little bodies, and it causes irreversible morphological changes that when you look under the microscope and you witness it, it's explosive shell growth and explosive gill growth in 1 day. And it kind of is mind-blowing what it looks like. It's awesome. It's just truly fascinating. They can double in volume in 1 day. They can go from a 250 micron larvae to a 500 micron poset in 1 day, or 1 or 2 days. And it's pretty amazing to watch. So I highly recommend you witnessing that. You can queue it up on, you know, on YouTube or Google and all this stuff, but come and see it live, because I've been growing shellfish for 32 years, and I've seen it's funny when I say this, it reminds me of the Blade Runner. It wasn't a robot. What were those? They were like android. I've seen the moons of. He's got the little speech of this. What was that? What were they? They were like cyborgs or something. But I've seen every intermediate stage. You see these eggs that start spinning around into what's called a morula. It's like, wow, it only took 5 hours for this thing to undergo all these cell divisions, and now it's actually moving around. It's only 5 hours old. And then you can see all of these larval stages under the microscope. You clearly can't see them in nature. You have to look at them microscopically. So I encourage you to just come by in the early months at the Marine Center, because it's something you're allowed to do. I mean, we have our own, Spat has its own shellfish hatchery that welcomes in all members to be a part of that. And it's really not anything that community people can do routinely in this country. We're one of the lucky places that allows you to do that, including killing, 1 million larvae. I've had people do that constantly to me. That's part of the learning process. You don't get chastised. If you do it every time, then we'll throw you out. But, we had somebody do some larval rearing, and I'm looking at him, it's like, wait, did you just use that hose? That's the freshwater hose. Oh, I thought you could put them in freshwater. Well, no, you can't put them in freshwater. They're saltwater creatures. So that was the end of that whole batch of scallops, as a matter of fact. So they didn't get thrown out. They're still there, and they're still working it, but it's a pretty harsh lesson. He moped around for a week or so. Okay. The principal reason for employing upweller systems is to increase the flow rate of water passing through a volume of shellfish seed. Absolutely. So that would get us into, and actually, this keeps coming up in conversation with different interns I have that are writing papers, and different oyster growers that are writing grants. this concept of what we call ceston flux. And, it sounds cool, ceston flux, but basically all we're talking about is a kind of a broad statement saying that flow times algae concentration equals growth. Very broad statement. There's a lot of things that you can inject into that statement. But the simple fact is that flow and algae are two things that can absolutely affect the growth of shellfish. Because they're filter feeders, they want to filter as much as they can get. So what we do in nature, you can't tweak either parts of those equations, but nature can. So for instance, if your dock is at the head of a creek like Goose Creek under the bridge that flows a 6-knot current in and out and in and out, and it has a good abundance of algae, good algae, you get unbelievable growth. And even at the Marine Center, there's a bunch of areas of our creek.
You're gonna miss the thing, I'll get it for you.
Uh-oh, somebody's making noise there. It must be, I can see who's unmuted, so it's either Marty or Elizabeth, so it's okay, but don't yell at your spouse. I hear you yelling at your spouse, so don't do that. You're being recorded. We can get you in, we can call in adult protective services on you or something. Maybe not. There probably isn't that, is there? Well, who knows?
Oh, no, he's not yelling.
Flow and algae, absolutely. So what we do is we can tweak the flow part of the equation by our machinery. So a land-based upweller, a floating upweller, a downweller, all of these things are equipments that mess with the flow rate by increasing, and that's something that you can be involved in. We run all of those things. We're still actually, I'm one of the few people that run. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I just think I'm one of the few people. Maybe somebody can see this on YouTube or whatnot and say, no, I've been doing that for years. Running a flupsy, a floating upweller system all winter long. I've got 10 to 34 barrels of seeds still running, and I'm going to run them all winter long. And we give them out in the spring as overwinter seed for folks that want to start early and are new members, and give them some overwinter seed to grow. And I run them all winter long. Do they grow during the winter? Probably not. They're still kind of hibernating. They will eat as long as there's algae in the water. But again, that ceston flux equation, tremendous flow times no algae, still comes out to no growth. So that's not my concern. I'm not trying to grow them over the winter. I'm just trying to keep them alive so that I don't have to put them in all kinds of different gear and get back to them. So oysters should never be left out of water for long 3 days. Again, part of this whole overwinter thing, and I mentioned Cape Cod a lot, but in Wellfleet, not yet, but maybe at the end of or mid-December, all the oyster growers will start pulling all of their oysters out of the water and putting them in containers upland for the entire winter. And then they'll put them back in maybe in, mid-March. They leave them out of the water for months during the winter. They don't want them to freeze, so they'll put them in a, containers, temperature controlled so that it doesn't go below freezing, but doesn't go above close to freezing. Just kind of put them in hibernation mode, and they can stay out of the water for months. Even in the summer, summer is a tricky time because you know, if you leave oysters out in the blaring sun and you can cook them. It's like the whole egg on the pavement type of deal. So you could still leave oysters even in the summer out of the water for days if you put them in your neighbor's garage. But don't forget about them. You come back like 2 weeks later and your neighbor's like, what's that smell in the back of my garage? Oh, yeah, I forgot about those oysters there. But, you know, again, in your refrigerator, and this whole thing, people ask me, how long can I keep oysters in my refrigerator? Well, don't do what I do, by the way. I could get fresh oysters every day. So how come I have oysters in my refrigerator for like 3 weeks? And then I find them, it's like, okay, these are still okay, I guess. But, you know, you eat them fresh, take them out and eat them fresh, but they will stay in your refrigerator. I think there's a phenomenon, and I'm going to say it like this. If you harvest oysters in warm water, let's say it's July and August, and you're having a party, so you're going to pull some of your oysters and you put them in the refrigerator. How long will they stay in the refrigerator? Well, I always say, you know, stack them in a bowl, cup side down, nice and neat. So if they open up, they won't spill all of their fluids out into the bowl. If you just throw them in the bowl and they're kind of sideways and they open up, they're just going to dump all their fluid out and they're going to dry out really fast. But what's interesting is that if you harvest oysters right now in cold water, put them in, they'll stay for a month easily. And I think the reason why is they're already chilled down from the water being so cold that when you put them in your refrigerator, they continue to kind of, don't get me wrong, they clam up. They're an oyster, but they clam up. Okay, they oyster up. No, they oyster up. They close up tight, like they're hibernating. Whereas in the summer, they're still, when you harvest them from warm water, they've still got to cool down as they go into your refrigerator. So they got a chance to open up to say, where am I? Can I breathe? You know, open up a little bit and maybe drop some fluid out. So I would say that if you don't forget about that you do this technique, that it might work. You harvest them in the summer and throw them in the freezer for like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, then put them in your refrigerator. If you leave them in the freezer and you forgot, you're probably then you have frozen oysters, which, by the way, I've never frozen an oyster to go back on in the shell or out of the shell to see how it would be defrosted. I think it would probably lose some texture to it. I've never done that. I probably never will attempt to, but they can stay out of the water for quite a while, which makes sense because, you know, oysters have developed a lot of their techniques through survival necessity. If an oyster metamorphoses, when it undergoes metamorphosis, it cements that day to something if it can. Okay, that's how oysters work. So they can cement to rocks, to shell, to other oysters. I've seen them on the docks over at Albertson. You go down to South Carolina, they're on every piling. They're all over the place, and then they're stuck there for the rest of their lives. So if they happen to set in a place like Bay of Fundy and the tide goes out, and there's certain cycles where it does, if it metamorphosed at a super high tide and it only gets covered by water every 4 days, then it's got to contend with that. So I think that's why they can handle pretty much being out of the water for a while. Dermopracensis marinus is a rare oyster disease that only affects oysters in Chesapeake Bay. Well, that's absolutely untrue. Dermo is pretty much in all of our oysters, and it might have come from the Chesapeake Bay, where it really affected the oysters of the Chesapeake Bay. It's been around for 40 plus years. I'd have to redo my It was probably a lot longer than that. Maybe that was in grad school. It was 40 years, but I'd have to relook at it. I'm not a shellfish pathologist, so I don't dwell on it that much, but I will tell you that dermo exists in our oysters. It's something you can eat oysters that have dermo in them. An oyster is riddled with dermo when you open it up like this time of year, and it would look like it spawned out like the summertime, a very kind of thin, baggy-ish oyster. That might be dermo. But it's not the end of our oysters because of colder winters than you have down south. Dermo can be a big issue. So that's false, by the way. It's not rare at all. The primary source, food source for shellfish is unicellular microalgae, regardless of the life stage of the animal. Well, in my opinion, that's true. I've heard, and I just heard yesterday, that ribbed mussels can eat bacteria as a food source. That's very interesting. Some people would say, oh, no, all shellfish can eat bacteria as a food source. Well, I don't care what people say they can eat as a food source. I will just make this statement. Their primary food source is unicellular microalgae. And without good, healthy unicellular microalgae, shellfish will not thrive. So they might be able to exist on a maintenance schedule with something other than unicellular micro, but they won't thrive. So, oh, what happened to my microphone? Why did my default microphone went off? Do I sound different? It just says my microphone my expensive microphone kicked off, and I'm not going to change it. Anyway, so yes, that's true, and that's why come out our algae situation over at the Marine Center. That's what we're doing now, is gearing up our algae room to get ready to start feeding shellfish for conditioning them. And it's pretty interesting, and it's just fascinating to watch how fast shellfish clear algae out of the system. Greenport and Peconic Bay once had prolific natural oyster reefs, which were harvested at their peak at the turn of the 20th century. Well, that's not how it worked, okay? There was absolutely a thriving oyster business in Greenport and Peconic Bay at the turn of the century. 1900, we were unbelievable at processing and selling oysters. And the pictures of the shucking houses, a lot of it was canned, mountains of shell. Was that from prolific natural oyster reefs? No, it was aquaculture back then. They were bringing the seed up from prolific seed beds and dumping it overboard in Greenport and the Peconic Bay to let them grow out there, and then raking them back up. And that industry stopped when the seed supply stopped. It was over harvested. Greenport and the Peconic Bay was never a huge oyster habitat like Manhattan was. That was all oyster reef. And there are lots of places that were huge oyster reefs, but not Peconic Bay and Greenport. That was aquaculture that fueled that industry. Okay, did everyone get all those right? Good. Now, multiple guests, and we're just going to go through this. Are people learning anything from this? I mean, this is why we do it. It's kind of cool, right? It's not that droll. It's probably the less drollish final you would take, I think. So I don't know. We'll keep going. Oh, Seston flux equation. We already did that. Algae, A times F equals Greek means, all these silly things. Aeration times food equals growth, wrong. Anatomy coupled with fertility equals genetic index, wrong. I like aquanetics through fluid propulsion influence gustation. Wow, where did I come up with these things? That's all cool. Algae concentration times flow equals growth. Hello, ambient times ambience times flavoring equals good times. Well, I think that's true too. So we'll give it to you if that's what you said. But the Seston flux equation again is that algae times flow equals growth. A good little. I like those other ones. I'm gonna go back and learn all of those. I like that. Okay. The Eastern oyster is or has a 2-year maximum lifespan. Oh, these are multiple guess. Okay. 2-year maximum lifespan? No, you're thinking maybe the scallop. Okay. Oysters can live 35 plus years. They're a pretty long-lived animal. The northern quahog goes even longer, 40 plus years. The oldest, by the way, here's your little raw bar one-liner or factoid. The oldest living invertebrate on the planet, okay, is a clam. There's 2 of them that can go 200 years. The tridacna, the giant clam that you see in Diver Dan movies that traps the diver by the leg, which they don't do, by the way, but you know, it's like this big clam. And the Arctic quahog, which is about this big, and you can buy them in Chinatown at the shops for a bag of them. I don't think they even know what they are. I keyed them out. Somebody brought me one. It's like, darn, that's an Asian quahog. They can live for 200 years, these tiny little clams. So you got a big clam, 200 years, and a tiny little Arctic quahog, 200 years. So that one was full. Where were we? I need glasses. A muscular foot for movement. No, you're thinking of a clam. Clam has a muscular foot that it uses for movement. It can go up and down like the Otis elevator guy, up and down in the sediment. They're infaunal. They can use their feet. You know how this is really fascinating. Has anyone ever watched a razor clam dig into the sediment? It's fascinating because what they do is they can be lying on the surface and then they go up and then zoop, right down. How do they do that? What they do is they take their foot, which is it's a muscle, they stick it in the sediment, and then the tip of it bulges like an anvil, and they retract, and it just sucks them right down into the sediment. It's fascinating. It's a really cool mechanism for getting down into the sediment quickly. And northern quahogs are hard shell clam. There's lots of different hard shell clams, but the one that we're used to has a muscular foot, and it can move around up and down. The Eastern oyster is a protangic hermaphrodite. That's true. What does it mean? It means that theoretically, when oysters are born and they're all spat and they're all the new little seed, they're all male. And so very early in their life cycle, they'll go 50-50 male to female. And apparently they can change sexes as needed, which I would say isn't, and this is a scientific term, don't think it isn't. They don't do it willy-nilly, okay? They do it when they must, due to maybe environmental stresses, where you can maybe get more females, because only the females count. Like human species, only the female counts, because only a female can make an egg to make a new individual. Us males, all you need is Charlton Heston. Really? I mean, you get the Omega Man. You just, that's all you need is one male in the planet. So, not Charlton Heston though. He's gone rogue on us. Okay. A true nacre layer. You know what? That's false. because oysters, how many times have people asked you, how many times have little kids asked me, do our oysters make a pearl? No, 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 Mary, no, little Tommy, they don't. Why? Because they don't have a true nacre layer. And the nacre layer is the mother of pearl layer. Now, our clams have a true nacre layer, and I've found pearls in our clams, but our oysters don't have that nacre layer, so they don't make a pearl. The Japanese black pearl oyster, Pinctada margaritifera, has a gorgeous nacre layer that makes a beautiful pearl. So that's where that comes from. The eastern oyster found throughout the east coast of the United States. True, we already talked about that. And stops growing south of the Carolinas. Nope, goes all the way down to Texas. And probably stops somewhere along in there. Maybe it's been creeping over more west and more towards Mexico, but I've got to find out more about Mexico. I don't know enough about what they're doing in Mexico with shellfish. Got to find that out. Which of the following are predators? Okay, so we're talking predators. Oyster toadfish. Oyster toadfish, you might see them in your cages or you might see them around your cages. Oyster toadfish are not a predator of oysters. They actually eat the predators that can affect an oyster. So for all that they're kind of funky looking, they're okay with me. Okay, I just saw a bunch of them today and put them back in the water. Oyster drill is a little tiny snail that is a voracious predator of oysters. And if you've ever seen, and other shellfish, if you ever picked up a shell on the beach and it looked like it had a little Dremel hole drilled into it, that's from the oyster drill. And it drills a little hole, not with its little spiral, its little ice cream cone spiral. It actually rasps a hole with its radula, which is it's like a tongue, like a cat tongue with like a rasp. And it rasps a hole, and then it injects its digestive fluids inside and eats the oyster that way. Well, which is also what a conchs do. Okay, boring sponge is not a predator of the oyster, but it wants the calcium in the shell. It uses the calcium in the shell. It becomes a real nuisance when you get boring sponge. If you've ever gone on the beach and picked up a shell that has pockfuls of holes in it, that's from the boring sponge. Sea squirt, nope, not a predator, just a nuisance. Oyster catcher, that's the bird with the red bill. That's a predator of oysters. It gets its name because it eats oysters. It's a gorgeous, that's a predator that you're not recommended to kill if you see it eating your oysters. You just say, oh, what a beautiful bird, and let it eat your oysters. All the rest of them you can crush with your boot. Not the oyster catcher. Club tunicate is not a predator. That's the thing that looks like a chicken leg growing off of your cages if you didn't clean your cages like mine for a year. I just went to a spot where I put oyster seed it's now 13 months. I hadn't touched these nets in 13 months, and I just pulled them up and they were glorious, except the fouling was unreal, but the oysters were also unreal. Why? Ceston flux. Great flow, great algae, forgives a lot of sins. I don't recommend you not tending your gear for 13 months. Mud crab, voracious predator, probably one of our most abundant predators that we have. The pea crab is whenever you're eating an oyster and you find this little crab inside of there, that's the pea crab. They're kind of funky looking. And when you're eating your oyster and it's crunchy and you're like, what was that? And you just ate a pea crab, it's edible. I mean, I remember the first time I ever discovered a pea crab, it was in Blue Mussels when I was in college in New London, and every single mussel had a pea crab in it. And I didn't know it for the first 4 or 5 mussels. But you can eat them, but they're kind of funky looking. You kind of turn your turn you into like, what is that? If I wanted to eat pea crabs, I'd order a bowl of pea crabs. I don't want pea crabs, but they're not a predator. It's a symbiotic relationship where the pea crab gets protection from the shellfish that it's in. And I don't know if the shellfish gets any benefit from the pea crab. So that would be it's that commensalism. Yes. Parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. Yes. Commensalism, by the way, since I'm going to spout these terms for you, parasitism is one benefits and one is harmed. That's parasitism. Commensalism is one benefits, the other doesn't get anything out of the deal. Mutualism is they both get something out of the deal. So a cleaner shrimp is apparently a mutual symbiotic relationship. And is there another one? No, that's it. Good. Knobbed whelk is like the oyster drill. We talked about that. The whelks are voracious predators of shellfish. Red-beard sponge is not a predator. It's not a predator, and it actually, we're getting to it. Grass shrimp is not a predator, and filamentous algae is not a predator. Now, which of the following can affect? Wait, that's oh no, yes, I did it. Which ones are fowlers? Okay, oyster toadfish isn't a fouling organism. We already talked about that. Oyster drill is a predator. Boring sponge is not a fouling organism on gear, but it's a problem. The way you get rid of, by the way, boring sponge is either by air drying or brine dipping, or just eat your oysters and get them out of your system if you've got boring sponge. If you're a commercial operator, you got to deal with that, but we're not commercial. Sea squirts are probably at least in my life, the worst fouling organisms that we have. They just never seem to quit. The sea grape, mogula, or sea squirt, the little balls, they look like eyeballs, and they get on everything, and they're like 98% water, and they're heavy, and they just never seem to go away. And boy, when you get them, they just are a tremendous fouler. And the most interesting thing about them is that they're not invertebrates. That to me almost makes them worthwhile having, just so you can say to people, you know, that thing is more closely related to us than the oyster is, because it's not an invertebrate. It's a urochordate. It's got a rudimentary backbone. It's got a notochord in its development. So it's not even in an invertebrate textbook. And you would look at it and say, are you kidding me? That thing is like, that's an animal? That's not even an animal. Isn't that just a blob of thing? Isn't that like an egg mass? No, that's the animal, and it's a urochordate. It's actually higher up on the evolutionary scale of things than all invertebrates, theoretically. So it's kind of cool, but it's still a nasty fouling organism, and you just can't get rid of them. Oh, my life. Now I'm going to have dreams about tunicates tonight. So yeah. That's why I don't like these finals. I'm going to go to sleep tonight, and all I'm going to think about is I wake up in the morning and I'm covered with sea squirts or something. Mud crab was a predator. Pea crab was a commensal symbiotic little guy hanging out in your shellfish. Knobbed whelk was a predator. Red-beard sponge can be a fouling organism. That stuff really can grow, and other sponges and other tunicates. One of the fouling organisms that isn't even on this list is the colonial tunicate that you'll see. I call it marine tool dip. It looks like tool dip. It's this rubbery, it's kind of, sometimes it's orange, sometimes it's black. And if you look closely on, they're little stars. They're called the star tunicate, and they're colonial. It's a whole mat of urochordates. And it can really cover your gear. I mean, Not your gear. You guys are good at cleaning gear. Everyone's keeping their gear. I see people pressure washing their gear that looks like they just got it brand new from underneath the table. It looks, you look at some of the stuff that I'm growing, you wouldn't even guess that there's an oyster in it, let alone, there's a whole community of stuff. It looks like Willie Nelson and Bob Marley went out to lunch at an all-you-could-eat pasta and hairy spaghetti dinner. I don't know. It's an awful mess. That's just me, though. Don't worry about it. You're doing a great job cleaning up. Grass shrimp, they just hang out. They love it. It's great habitat, and everything likes to eat grass shrimp, so they're fine. Filamentous algae can be a fouling organism. Again, you pull up your cages and it's full of this kind of hairy looking algae. All algae can be a fouling organism. Not harmful, but it restricts flow. And there's your ceston flow equation again. Okay, which can affect growth of shellfish? Algae concentration, we already said it could. Sexual dimorphism. I don't think so. It's always a trick thing that you pull on little kids. You hold up a big oyster and a little oyster and you say, which one's the male and which one's the female? And they'll say sometimes if it's a well-trained kindergarten, the girls will say, the big one's the girl. It's not usually. It makes no difference. There's no sexual dimorphism that I've pulled out in shellfish anyway. Flow rate of water, there's the cestine flux equation again. Shell color, apparently not. Genetics, I'm working on genetics. We're going to do our first spawn on February 1st using 11.5-month-old giant oysters. The giant oysters from this year's seed we're going to use to spawn our first spawn, because I'm trying to tweak that fact that some of these oysters grow so fast. Is it a genetic trait for fast growth? And we're trying to look at that. For the last 2 years, we've been growing oysters that are, I had somebody at the Marine Center yesterday, and they were going through their, what is today? Yes, yesterday. They were going through their oysters and they said, well, this is all this year's oysters. None of them are big enough to eat yet. And I picked one up. It was about maybe 2 inches. And I opened it up and it was perfect. It was busting out of the shell. It was the most exquisite little oyster. And it's 10 months old. And they were very happy. Except it turns out the guy didn't eat oysters. The wife ate oysters. If you're in the program and you don't eat oysters, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But you should try one of your own oysters, because you might change your opinion on what oysters taste like. We're growing some of the best oysters you can eat. So stocking density in aquaculture gear, I think so. And you can play with that. You can lightly stock some cages to see if you get bigger oysters, or you can densely stock them to see if you can get little stunted nuggets. But I think stocking density in aquaculture gear can make a big difference in shell growth. Stock market prices. Well, let's face it, everything is affected by stock market prices. I found that out when I actually had money to invest. Oh, what a mistake. I should have just stayed a pauper my whole life. Now I worry about where the little money I had went. The stock market. Water temperature definitely, but I wouldn't say that it's always positive on the hot side. And I think our water is going to get so hot in certain times of the year that it's going to cause a lack of growth. So there's this fine line of too cold, too hot. It's that whole Three Little Bears, the bear, some bears, some Goldilocks. Yeah, thanks. It's been see, my wife teaches kindergartners. I've given up on all of Aesop's fable. No? Anyway. Yes, water temperature. Spawn date. Spawn date. Well, I will tell you that we spawn very early. And because we do that, we can grow a 10, 11, 12 to 18-month oyster. If we were to spawn our stock like when they spawn naturally in July, they would never get as big as they get. So spawn date for aquaculture can make a huge difference. And political affiliation, let's not go there. This is an older quiz, no doubt, where you could actually talk politics. You can't talk politics anywhere anymore. So we're not going to. But please vote. That's our final exam. Did anyone learn anything? I did. I always have fun. I have fun. I have fun reminiscing with people I don't know. No, that's Stephen Wright joke. Yeah. Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's a good thing I've been muted because I've been laughing most of the time.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you don't have to stay muted. You know, none of you have to stay muted. Keep in mind that we're a family here. This is, and I want to give a shout out. I went yesterday to our Cornell staff meeting, and because Otto Schmid got Outstanding Volunteer of the Year award for his tenure at Spat. He's been with me 22 of 23 years, and he just got awarded the Outstanding
That's amazing.
Outstanding Volunteer of the Year award. So that's just a heads up for you guys that you too can be out. You're all outstanding to me. I mean, when it comes to Cornell, whatever. I hardly get my paperwork done on time. They all want to know success stories. I live success stories incarnate with Spat. I don't have to personally don't have to prove that. I revel in it every day of my life with this group. And so, you know, as we go into the new year, keep in mind we're always around. I'm using up, when I say we're always around, I actually only have 4 more working days in the year, but I'm not going anywhere. And I look at my emails, I'll answer my texts, I'll answer my phone. I consider myself to be on 24/7 call for what we do. So, you know, and that's how it's been since the beginning. We're going into our 24th year, and you know, we have a remarkably unique group and program. And I say that only because I was afforded the luxury of working for a place that allowed me to do what we do. And nobody else seems to allow anybody to do that because nobody else does it the way we do it. So it's a gift, and we live here in this beautiful place and we get this gift. So use it, enjoy it, don't fret about anything. It's all part of what we do as we're learning and trying new things and having fun. When it's no fun anymore, you can't do it anymore. It's got to be fun. Come by Celebration if you want. That's going to be on the first week of December. We'll be at the brewery and at Ian's Shuckham place, Little Creek, and First and South. So we're at 3 locations. And if I get enough shuckers, I'm going to try to play some music on the street with my Shuck and Jive band with Dave Burson. So
that sounds good.
Yeah, as long as it's not freezing cold and I have enough shuckers, we're gonna panhandle on the street. Don't if I put a hat out, you can just drop old shells in there, you know. It's not to make money, it's to have some fun. I have to have fun with this, and I always have fun with it. So we just gotta have more fun. So that's that. Now you can go and have dinner unless you have any questions. You want to?
Where is it? What about our extra credit question? What does
nobody gets that right. Spat, you see, the thing is, Spat, yeah, the extra credit. What is Spat? Well, Spat, by the way, is the term for newly metamorphosed or poset or new seed. So the term used to be, oh, we had a great spat fall this year, means there was a lot of new shellfish, little seed. That's spat, and it's called spat. So I took that and made the acronym. In the year 2000, I started the Suffolk Project in Aquaculture Training. And then we went global. And so all my executive directors made me change it to Suffolk Project in Aquaculture Training, probably to get more money from the legislators, or whatever it was. It's now Suffolk Project in Aquaculture Training, and nobody gets it right, which doesn't bother me. It's SPAT, and it fits on our hats and our shirts. You can't, oh, this is the whole thing on it. What does it say? It says Southhold. I guess I never changed, it's, I'm an old
That's
dog. I
fine.
haven't learned any new tricks, but it doesn't count. Spat is spat. But actually, if you go to Wellfleet, they have a spat program, and it's terrible what it means. What it means is special promotions and tastings. It's lame. God, that's your spat program? That has nothing to do with anything except eating oysters. No, it's all right. I never
Hey,
read.
Kim,
Yes.
Susan Hoffman and I have been working on getting
Yes,
out a
thank you.
marketplace for the holidays.
Yes.
So we should be rolling that out next week.
Okay, so what Darcy is saying, Darcy's there somewhere. They have been working on new swag, and we're going to get an email out for the holidays as special orders, all kinds of different t-shirts, not t-shirts, fleeces, jackets, beanies, a whole list of stuff that people can, with the logo on it. And so we're seeing it. We've done that in the past, not that often, and it was a big success. It takes work. So Susan is now our new swag queen, and she's probably trying to get outstanding swag queen of the year award. So she's
Well, it's going to
working.
be nice quality items coming from Steve King at his East End Sporting Goods in Matata. So
You
we're staying local. Yeah.
We have the best hats of anybody. Everyone's been giving me these hats from all the oyster companies, and obviously they're cheaping out because nobody has a hat like our hat. So anyway, so you'll be seeing an email, and there's no hard sell on it, but if you want anything for the holidays, we're doing it so that you can get it in for the holidays, including some packages like the stainless steel glove with a quality knife, probably you can get with the little shucking boat, an apron, a thing. We're going to make it so that you can do some nice presents. Some people give gift certificates for memberships, for presents. Whatever you want to do, we can figure that out. Good. So that's that. Feel free to reach out anytime, and thanks for sticking with the whole exam. And if you need anything, just drop me a line.
Thanks,
Good.
Kim.
Thanks,
Good
buddy.
job.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. And Darcy, you can stop recording, and we're all set. And then
Got it.
thank you.